Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Burt Folsom about his book, Uncle Sam Can't Count, A History of Failed Government Investments from Beaver Pelts to Green Energy, which he co-authored with his wife, Anita Folsom. Dr. Folsom is a professor of history at Hillsdale College. He is also the author of The Myth of the Robber Barons, A New Look at the Rise of Big Business in America, and New Deal or Raw Deal, How FDR's Economic Legacy Has Damaged America. He is a co-author with Anita Folsom of FDR Goes to War. You can follow his work at burtfolsom.com. That's Burt, B-U-R-T, Folsom, F-O-L-S-O-M.com. You can find him on Facebook under Burt Folsom and on Twitter at Burt Folsom. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/government-investments. Burt, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adam. I'm glad to be with you today.
Well, it's great to have you with me. Thanks for joining me. So let's start out with an overview of your book and what it covers.
Yes. Well, Uncle Sam Can't Count, that's kind of an odd title. What it signifies is that Uncle Sam can't count in the sense of money, subsidies, and also it's a question of judgment. I look at failed government subsidies from George Washington to Barack Obama, which is, of course, the entire range of U.S. history. And most of these subsidies are not widely known, but a lot of times government has tried to prompt economic development by subsidizing enterprises. It started with the fur trade under Washington, continued to be, for example, things like the telegraph under President Polk. We had subsidies for steamship subsidies in the 1840s and 50s, railroad subsidies in the 60s, and even a subsidy to invent the airplane under President Theodore Roosevelt. All were disastrous failures. Almost none of these are discussed in typical American history textbooks, but they're critical to understanding American history.
Now, you obviously gave some examples in there, but what do these subsidies usually look like, and how are they obtained, and who typically obtains a subsidy along the lines of what you discuss in your book?
Often you have the political class, a connection there with various congressional leaders, with a businessman. I loosely term a businessman, not really what we'd think of as an entrepreneur willing to risk his own money. We're talking about a businessman who gets the idea that if he can get a subsidy from the government, then that will benefit him, and, of course, the employment that it will inevitably, he thinks, increase will benefit the nation. That's usually the argument that goes forth. And so it's usually a combination of a politician plus a businessman working together to get the businessman a subsidy for a particular enterprise. In the case of steamships, for example, in the late 1840s, the idea was we need to have a government-funded steamship company to vault the United States into transatlantic steamship travel, and we would send goods back and forth to England. We didn't rely on the free market, but we instead chose the subsidies. But, of course, what happened was that Cornelius Vanderbilt intervened and did his own steamship service without any subsidy and ended up doing a better job than the subsidized company. In fact, the subsidized company under Edward Collins requested an increase in his subsidy so that he could compete with the private company that had no subsidy, and Congress granted him that increase.
All right, and since earlier you said that these subsidies usually are failures, and as well as the title of the book, Uncle Sam Can't Count, A History of Failed Government Subsidies, it suggests that. So why do these government investments often fail? Is it just different by circumstance, or is there something inherent to this type of subsidy that causes these failures?
That's a very good question. It's not just circumstance, as you suggested in one of your alternatives there. There are incentives that are in place, oddly enough, that make it easier for a private firm to succeed than one subsidized by the government. This isn't something that most people commonly think about, and that's why I think history is so important as we look at the idea of federal funding for any program, that we look to the past, what's happened in the past, and use that as our guide to what we should do in the present. Let me give you just one example. The incentives for a subsidized company are different from the incentives to succeed for a private company. In the case of a private company, you have competitors out there. You're trying to succeed in the free market. So you try to produce a better product at a more competitive price. And so if you're in the railroad business, for example, you want to produce a train and a locomotive on track that runs more smoothly, shorter distance perhaps, build the track a little bit better, and compete on the basis of carrying as much traffic as you can for as little cost as you can. If you have a federally subsidized company, the incentives change, because then you're getting money from the government, and so you don't have as much of an incentive to be efficient. Now, you might think, well, what about the private companies that may come along? Oftentimes, the government company will increase its subsidy, or it will try to prevent the private competitors from competing. We saw this in the fur trade with the case of the government fur company when it saw effective competition coming from John Jacob Astor in the fur trade. The government company tried to put license fees in effect that would make it very difficult. You'd have everybody in the fur trade had to pay special fees. And so in effect, you're adding costs to your opposition. So what I'm saying is that a government company has incentives not to be competitive and produce a good product at a low price, but has an incentive to keep up and put its efforts into continuing the subsidy and trying to prevent competitors from getting in the market to compete.
All right, and you obviously touched on this some there, but with this long history and track record of failure, why do these subsidies continue into the present day? And just how corrupt is this whole business, shall we say, of handing out these subsidies?
Corruption is often a hallmark of a federal subsidy, and in fact, when the corruption is exposed, then those who favor subsidies say, aha, we would have succeeded if only this fellow had not been corrupt. But the problem is the incentives, as I said, create situations where the subsidized businessman has incentives to perpetuate the subsidy, so naturally he, in effect, buys off politicians if he can. In other words, he'll try to make campaign contributions, various kinds of dealings with politicians to keep the subsidy in place. Those are his incentives. The private entrepreneur, the one without the subsidy, knows that he has to produce a good product at a fair cost, and so he will be trying to figure out, hey, how do I produce this product more cheaply? And so, yes, corruption enters into the picture, and as I say, the incentives are structured in such a way that the non-subsidized entrepreneur has incentives to work in the customer's interest. The subsidized businessman has incentives to try to perpetuate his subsidy.
All right, so let's dive into some of the examples that you discuss in your book. And since you mentioned that the book covers the history of government investments and subsidies and their failures from George Washington to Barack Obama, that obviously suggests that this was already taking place during the Washington administration. So what would you point to as being the earliest examples of this? Would it be John Jacob Astor and the fur trade and Beaver Pelts? Would that be sort of the first example where we can really start, or was there something even before that?
No. The example of the fur trade is the first one, and there we have actually, unfortunately, President Washington a little bit involved. He thought that a government fur company would be necessary to prevent the British from coming in and dominating the fur trade and from in effect, invading our country, having that British presence in our new nation, perhaps stirring up the Indians, because the Native Americans or our Indians were intimately involved in trapping the animals. So Washington didn't want that, and that was his maneuver to try to stop it, was to help create that government company. So, yeah, that's the first one.
Okay, and then you discuss Cornelius Vanderbilt. And you mentioned this some already, but can you explain just why Vanderbilt's business model allowed him to succeed, whereas his competitors, particularly those receiving government subsidies, failed?
Right. He is in the Vanderbilt chapter. His story is fascinating, the Vanderbilt, because he competed against subsidized competitors on the New York to England route on the Atlantic, and then he also had subsidized competitors going to Panama, crossing Panama, and going to the West Coast. So he competed against subsidized companies on both sides of the ocean. And in both cases, the subsidized competitors had an incentive to perpetuate their subsidy, while Vanderbilt figured out, hey, I've got to produce a better product. Vanderbilt did that by, for example, he would charge less of a fare. He'd charge lower fares. He would get more people on his ships. He might get 600 on his ships, whereas the subsidized companies would get maybe 100, 200, 300 people. And so he had twice as many customers, and he understood the concept of fixed costs. That is, his cost of going from New York to Liverpool, England, were about the same whether he had 600 passengers or 200. So he thought, hey, let's get as many on here as possible, and I'll sell them food. Vanderbilt helped invent the potato chip, for example. He would serve food on his voyages. He would have cheaper rates, and he invented a third-class fare, which really packed people in, but they could go from New York to Liverpool, England, sometimes for as low as $35. The standard rate started at $200. Was around $120 that the government company had, and Vanderbilt completely cut rates. Immigration to the United States was influenced by Vanderbilt because that's where immigrants could come over to this country to settle. The cheap fares offered by Vanderbilt.
Well, that's remarkable that he had such an influence that even immigration trends were in part influenced by his abilities as an entrepreneur. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the subject of internal improvement subsidies. This is something that in the typical American history textbook or the typical American history class, it seems the way it's portrayed is that these subsidies were absolutely necessary, and without these internal improvement subsidies and the related projects, we wouldn't have all of the wonderful infrastructure that we have today, or that those before us were able to enjoy. So what's the truth about the internal improvement subsidies, and what might the typical narrative get wrong on this?
That's a good question, but your starting point is exactly right, Adam. The textbook treatment of the internal improvements, as they were called in the 1800s, these canals, railroads, there's a belief that the federal government, or at least the state government, had to be involved. In the case of the state government, I'm thinking of the Erie Canal, which was built in the 1820s in New York. The state government built that canal, and it was profitable. So it appears as though the subsidy was important, necessary, and even helpful. What is missed in that is that the terrain from New York to Albany and then Albany to Buffalo, where the canal ran, is fairly flat, so that really any private firm could have eventually built that canal. Because you had a state-built canal, it created the idea we needed to get the state governments involved, and every other canal project, including 8 others in the state of New York, was unprofitable. We had a canal project in my state where Hillsdale College is in Michigan that cost $350,000 to build, and it earned $90.32. And that's not far and away about fairly typical of these canal projects. Maybe not quite as bad, but still very bad. Most states invested in canals where the terrain was not good, or that they became politicized. They became a parking place for political appointees who really were not good at running canals. And the end result was all of them except for the Erie Canal failed. The Pennsylvania Canal, the mainline canal from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, almost bankrupted the state of Pennsylvania. It was so unprofitable. So what I'm saying is that the state government subsidies did not work, but the states thought they would work because the Erie Canal was profitable. And so the history of the Erie Canal is usually presented as a success story for the federal government. But in fact, by the time the Erie Canal was done and the other 8 canals in New York had failed, the state of New York was near bankruptcy because of its canal experiences.
Well, and that's something that you don't hear and you don't read in the typical textbook.
No, and that's why I'm glad you're asking me, because it's a chance for people who have been misinformed by the typical history textbook to see that the subsidies failed, and therefore we should not get too eager to get the federal government or the state government involved in subsidizing public enterprises.
All right, so let's move on to what happened in your home state of Michigan. And this seems to me to be a particularly fascinating story with the boy governor, Stevens T. Mason. So who was he, and how does he fit into this larger picture of failed government investments and the failure of government subsidies?
Stevens T. Mason, you're right, was the governor of Michigan. He was the first governor of Michigan. He actually became acting governor of Michigan when he was 19 years old, which is shocking, except that he was really very, very bright. He was a boy genius, a child prodigy. And he also had a good personality, so he ultimately became the first governor of the state of Michigan. And he believed, and again, he was considered very smart, he believed that Michigan needed to imitate New York and subsidize its internal improvements. So we had that canal that I mentioned. We also built 2 railroads here in the state of Michigan. One of them went right to Hillsdale, Michigan, which is where Hillsdale College is, where I teach. And it goes halfway to Michigan, or halfway across Michigan, and neither canal was finished, or neither railroad was finished. The canal was not finished, but the railroads weren't either. The state ran out of money halfway across the state. So what the state of Michigan did, it had no money. It had poorly built railroads that only went halfway across the state. They privatized the railroads. The railroads were sold to a private enterprise, and the private firm completed the railroads across the state. And it didn't cost the state of Michigan anything because they simply sold the existing railroads to the private firm who agreed to finish them and rebuild them and make them run. And that's exactly what happened. In other words, the state of Michigan tried an experiment in state-built railroads. It failed. They privatized the railroads. The railroads succeeded.
So one other internal improvement project I want to touch on here, and that's the National Road. What exactly was the National Road, and what sorts of subsidies were involved in that project?
That was an early attempt to build a road for the immigrants coming into the United States, and it was actually done under President Jefferson, who usually was good on issues of freedom and limited government. Jefferson was a good president. Not on the National Road, however. He encouraged the building of what we call the National Road, and it was going to start in Maryland, near the state, near D.C., and it was going to go all the way out to Illinois. And the idea was we'd have a road built by the government to help immigrants settle the country. This was especially seen to be a good idea after the Louisiana Purchase, when we bought the American Midwest, and hey, let's get it settled. Unfortunately, the government-built National Road was a huge failure, in part because it didn't go straight. The politicians in each state were able to maneuver which cities the road went through, and so it was not a straight road. It was a politically directed road. That was one problem. The second problem was when the government owns something, in this case the road, the incentives for repair are not very good. No one owns it, so no one is accountable for it. What I'm saying is that a privately built road would have the owner would have an incentive to keep the road in good shape. The National Road didn't have that same set of incentives, and so what happened was it was built. It has stones on the road people would just come in and start stealing the stones. You didn't have anybody to guard the National Road because no one owned it. It fell into disrepair quickly, and in fact, it was useless for settlement. And people who had to live along the roads, in fact, to get messages somewhere, couldn't travel the road because it was so slow. They had to buy carrier pigeons to transmit the information from one place to another. And it was about at that point that the government gave up on the National Road. And so that was good because it didn't cost the taxpayers any more money.
All right, so let's move on to the railroads. And I know we're jumping all over the place here, but there are so many topics I want to get to, so many interesting stories that I want to give the listeners a taste of here. So let's move on to the railroads, and in particular, James J. Hill. Now, some people might be familiar with him because the Dagny Taggart character in Atlas Shrugged is in several ways based on James J. Hill. But who exactly was James J. Hill, and what's the story about him and his competitors and the role government subsidies played in that?
Well, yes, the Transcontinental Railroads are probably the best known federal subsidy. And the textbooks often do cover that. They ignore the Vanderbilt subsidy, the fur trade subsidy, for example, and even the airplane subsidy. I almost never see covered in the textbook. But the Transcontinental Railroads do get covered, and so that's useful, therefore, especially for us to talk about. People know about the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. They were subsidized railroads that crossed the country from Omaha to Sacramento, California. It sounds like, hey, that's good. It gets railroads across the country. Well, the railroads were subsidized, and just to give an idea here of how bad it went under the government system, they did ultimately, although they did complete the railroad, it was a dysfunctional railroad right from the start. The rails were poorly done. The gradient was too steep in many places for a railroad to effectively operate. It had to be rebuilt. It was very expensive because we paid the railroad builders, and we also gave a lot of free land out west away to the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads. The United States national debt when we started building the Transcontinental Railroads was $60 million. We spent more than that giving away money to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific, more than the entire national debt from Washington to Abraham Lincoln. We spent building that railroad. And it was so poorly done, as I say, it had to be rebuilt. And finally, James J. Hill, with his Great Northern Railroad, showed us the way. He had no federal subsidy, and he went from St. Paul, Minnesota to Seattle, Washington. No federal aid, and it was a much better built railroad than the subsidized railroads that were so poorly done and were built in the 1860s.
Well, and with James J. Hill, we really see a lot of parallels between his business career and his life as well, and that of John Jacob Astor. Oh,
yes. And Hill, it's interesting, by the way, that these unsubsidized entrepreneurs often ended up being very wealthy. Astor was the first American to be worth $10 million. Vanderbilt was the first American to be worth $100 million. And both of those two made their money by producing really good products at competitive prices, much better than the government competitors that they had to go up against to be successful. Hill was in the same boat. He's a Canadian immigrant, very successful. He learned the railroad business well. He knew his business. He built a railroad that was on relatively flat terrain, even though he had to really scout out the Rocky Mountain area carefully. His railroad was beloved all the way from North Dakota and Montana. They were so pleased to have someone come through and provide this rail service, and it turned out to be a better railroad than the one that went through from Nebraska to California. So the Great Northern Railroad was a landmark achievement, and many people think it was the best railroad built in the United States by 1900.
Wow. So let's move on to the Wright brothers. Now, you've mentioned airplane subsidies a couple of times already, and mentioned the Wright brothers as well. So what's the story with the Wright brothers and with Samuel Langley? And who was Samuel Langley? Because I'm guessing most people probably haven't heard of him.
Right. The Wright brothers, of course, were the ones who invented the airplane. They were two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, who took $2,000 of their own money. They experimented with gliders and other kind of aircraft in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and eventually invented invented the airplane. It was a remarkable effort on the Wright brothers' part to invent the airplane. But they were preceded. That's often people know that, but what most people don't know is that the Wright brothers were preceded by Samuel Langley, who had a federal subsidy to invent the airplane. The government again got involved in building the airplane. Most people thought they learned their lesson after the Transcontinentals and the steamships. And it's true that we didn't have very many federal subsidies in the late 1800s, which is partly why we had 28 straight years of budget surpluses during the 1870s and 80s and even into the 1890s. And we had budget surpluses because we said, hey, no more of this federal subsidy business. It doesn't work. We then got back in the subsidy business with the airplane because we thought, or at least Teddy Roosevelt, President McKinley, and several others, along with Samuel Langley, who was head of the Smithsonian Institution, said, hey, if we don't get in there and give a subsidy to invent the airplane, the French or the Germans may get there ahead of us. And so we need to be the first one, or they may even drop bombs on us, who knows. We've got to be the first ones to invent the airplane. And we can't wait for the free market to work. And so Langley was given the subsidy, head of the Smithsonian Institution. He had honorary degrees from Harvard and Yale and Oxford and Cambridge. He'd written a book on aerodynamics called Experiments in Aerodynamics. He built a model plane that crossed the Potomac. And they thought, hey, let's give him a subsidy to do a man-made plane, a man-controlled plane, and have it cross the Potomac. And so he had that subsidy, and he totally failed. The private company, the Wright brothers, succeeded. Langley had two attempts. Both of them flopped right into the Potomac. There was no flight whatsoever. And even, the Washington Post, after one of his flights, said, any 15-year-old could have skimmed a rock further than Langley's airplane. It was a total disaster. It was a false theory of flight. He thought that you could shoot a plane in the air like a catapult. The idea of a runway was the idea that the Wright brothers were working with. And so we subsidized the wrong guy. And the Wright brothers insisted that it be done, their subsidy, that they do their business privately. They never sought a government money. And they did their airplane with only $2,000 of their own invested money. And that great invention done privately in the United States, a nation with good property rights, minus a federal subsidy.
Wow, and of course this is never or almost never in history books, but
yeah, I almost never see that story in a history book. It's almost unknown. When I speak to audiences, I hardly ever encounter anybody who knows the story.
Yeah, it's just amazing. So let's go back to your home state of Michigan. We obviously discussed the boy governor earlier, but let's talk about someone else with Michigan ties, Herbert Dow.
Yes.
So what can you tell us about Herbert Dow and how government subsidies impacted the careers of himself and of his competitors?
This is a more fun story for Americans because here the subsidized company is not an American company, it's Germans. The Germans gave a monopoly to their chemical producing groups to produce things like aspirin, to produce bromine, which is used in the development of photographic film and also as a sedative. They had various chemical products that they invented, and they allowed monopolies to have charge of marketing these products. And when Herbert Dow came along and was able to market these products more cheaply than the Germans could, their response was to undercut him to try to knock him out of the business. You've all heard of the concept of predatory price cutting. And that's what the Germans tried against Dow. And Dow had a delightful response. He was a better competitor than the Germans. So when they cut prices below the cost of production, they thought that would knock him out of business. He simply went out and secretly bought up all the product they were producing below cost. Then he marketed their own product under his name to countries all around the world, and they couldn't figure out how Dow was thriving. Well, he was thriving because he was getting his product below cost because he was buying the product that the Germans were producing below cost. And so he did that for 4 years before the Germans caught on. And during those 4 years, 1904 to 1908, was where we really get the beginnings and the triumph of America's Dow Chemical Company. And the Dow Company, the Dow people have ended up becoming a supporter of Hillsdale College, which I always thought was good because Hillsdale College, where I teach, takes no federal subsidies. And Herbert Dow competed effectively against the Germans who were taking government money, and he was competing privately.
Well, and we did an episode on monopolies and antitrust laws, and we touched on predatory pricing in there. This was with Tom DiLorenzo. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/government-investments, the show notes page for this episode. We'll also have a link to that one. But sticking with the Michigan...
Tom DiLorenzo is good. Tom DiLorenzo understands, his economic understanding is good in that he understands that in the late 1800s, American companies that were successful produced competitive products at ever decreasing prices, always decreasing prices. And Tom DiLorenzo has demonstrated that. He's, in that respect, a good economist.
Yeah, and of course that's something that not only will you not find that in the typical textbook, it's the exact opposite of what you will find in the typical textbook. But I want to move on to another Michigan-related issue, and that's Detroit. So, in what ways did government subsidies impact the rise and fall of Detroit and the way that city developed over the years?
Detroit had the auto industry, and Henry Ford is a good, what I call a market entrepreneur. I distinguish between market entrepreneurs, those who compete with no federal aid, and then political entrepreneurs, those who try to be successful by receiving federal subsidies. And what we find simply is that Detroit, when it was relying on market entrepreneurs like Henry Ford, and others too, like Thomas Durant, who started General Motors. Although he was in Flint, Detroit is nearby, and Detroit became, in various ways, an auto center. And likewise, Ford is in Dearborn a lot, but Detroit is kind of the central place there. And we find that Detroit benefits from the growth of American industry and privately developed American industry. In the 1960s, Detroit leadership began to try to rely on federal subsidies with the beginning of the Great Society. And there we see the decline of Detroit. And it's very sad because Detroit once had about 2 million people. Now it's down to about 700,000. And the fall of Detroit has been in a time when private industry has not been encouraged. In fact, the tax rates for private industry are rather high in Detroit, local taxes and such, and they've relied heavily on government money, and that has been a disaster, and Detroit has been poorly run politically for the last 50 years. It's really a sad story, but it shows what happens when you turn to the government funds, which are seemingly free and wonderful, and you neglect the private entrepreneurs, the private industry that is so essential to economic growth.
All right, and from your state of Michigan to my state of Texas, and one of the most prominent Texans of the last century was George Mitchell, the late George Mitchell. So what can you tell us about George Mitchell and fracking and the way the oil industry has changed based on what he accomplished as a businessman, and how his competitors were the ones receiving the subsidies and not so much him?
Yes, George Mitchell is a wonderful entrepreneur, and he has done well for Texas and his country. The last part of my book, I have a lot on the oil industry and on ethanol, because those have been the recently subsidized products. And George Mitchell fits into the picture here because the argument was that we heard in the 1970s was that the oil production days are over. We need alternate fuels. We need to have government-funded ethanol using corn and sugar, these kinds of products, farm products to make ethanol, especially corn. So we had that development in the 1970s because the widespread belief was that we were running out of oil. But what we always find is once entrepreneurs are encouraged, there are often substitutes that come in. Oil or ethanol has a lot of inefficiencies, and it's expensive, and it uses 40% of the corn crop, thus raising prices for everybody, including middle-class, poor people who really don't need to have high products for what they buy at the store. But oil subsidies were present, and ethanol subsidies were present, and George Mitchell, with his fracking, was able to uncover lots of oil that we never thought we would be able to get to. And he's been able to do so in a way that has not been environmentally damaging. He was always very sensitive about that. And so what we have are access to cheap oil now that we never knew in the 1970s we would be able to uncover. And so cheap oil is now back on the scene, and we never really needed those huge ethanol subsidies.
All right, and one final example I want to touch on before we wrap up here, and this was in the news a few years ago and was a very hot-button issue a few years ago, and that's the Solyndra episode. So what exactly happened there, and why did those subsidies fail so miserably?
Solar panels is what we're dealing with here with Solyndra, and this is back to the idea that we're running out of cheap fossil fuel, therefore we need to get wind power and sun power and that kind of thing. So we gave huge subsidies to anybody who could do wind power. You know, the windmill building is subsidized. The solar panel industry, of which Solyndra was a part, was subsidized. And they built solar panels, but they were terrible. Let me put it this way: they were terribly expensive, and they could not make them profitably. And so the firm ended up with $500 million worth of funding, and it went broke. And the saddest part of that is that, one of the sad parts of it, is that when it went broke, there were people in President Obama's administration that wanted them to delay the news that they were going to go broke until after the 2010 midterm elections. We're back again to seeing the connection that invariably exists between politics, between government people, and between the businessman. And the failure of these subsidies, and often how it involves business people and how it involves politicians in a very insidious way that's very bad for the taxpayer, very bad for the American citizen. The American people do not benefit when government colludes with business.
No. So if we were to to learn some lessons for today from this history of government subsidies and their failures, what would they be?
The lesson is that if we want to develop, it's better to develop slowly and privately rather than develop quickly with government money. By that I mean taxpayer money. When you develop slowly and privately, your chances of success are much greater than when you develop with federal funds.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I obviously mentioned this at the beginning of the episode, but in case someone missed it or they're starting for some reason in the middle of the episode, what are the best ways to follow your work? And also, can you talk about some of your other books as well, or more about this book, anything you'd like to promote here?
Right. I have a website at burtfolsom.com, B-U-R-T, folsom.com. The key books here are Uncle Sam Can't Count, the book that we've been talking about today. I have a book called The Myth of the Robber Barons, and I have two books on Franklin Roosevelt, one entitled New Deal or Raw Deal, and the sequel entitled FDR Goes to War, which I co-authored with my wife, Anita.
All right, well, very good, and I want to remind everybody to go check out the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/government-investments. And, of course, there will be multiple links to the book we've been discussing today, which, again, is Uncle Sam Can't Count, A History of Failed Government Investments from Beaver Pelts to Green Energy. And there will also be links to the other books we've mentioned, as well as to BurtFolsom.com and the appropriate Facebook and Twitter pages as well. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/government-investments. Again, that's the show notes page for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody, while they're on our website, to sign up for our email list and subscribe on Stitcher or iTunes or the podcatcher of your choice so that you can stay up to date on what's going on with the show and make sure to catch all the episodes. And Burt, thank you very much for joining me today to discuss this very interesting book. And hopefully we'll be able to speak again in the future. I'd love to talk about the robber barons with you and smash that myth to the ground.
Sure. Adam, good to be with you today.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.